We want to understand our New Testaments. If we're going to understand the New Testament, we definitely have to know a lot about the Old Testament. So much of the New Testament is the Old Testament. That's the primary context, you might say, for the New Testament. But at the same time, it also definitely helps to know a little bit about the time between the Testaments. The Old Testament ends about 400 years or so before the New Testament begins. And that time, what happens in that time to Israel, provides a lot of the cultural context for understanding what we're reading about in the Gospels and in Acts and in the letters of the New Testament. And so we're going to take a little time and just go back and make sure we've got a grasp on the intertestamental period. And if you remember, the Old Testament ended with a nation or empire called Persia in control of Jerusalem. And as we look at this period, we're going to talk about 5 major empires and 5 major crises. I think there's a book by Andreas Kostenberger on an introduction to the New Testament that summarizes it this way, and it's definitely helpful. And then we're going to think about the implications of those crises in particular. But there were 5 major groups that ruled over Palestine during the years between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New. And we have mentioned the first 2 in the previous video. There was Babylon, and they ruled from 606 to 539. And then there was Persia, and they ruled from 539 to 331. The third group were the Greeks, and the Greeks ruled from 331 to 167 BC. The Jews were able to rule themselves from 167 to 63 BC, and then came the Romans from 63 BC to 70 AD. So the Old Testament ends with this empire named Persia in control of Jerusalem. And what's happening towards the end of the Old Testament with Israel is very significant, because Israel is intended to be the means through which God is going to bring blessing to the entire world. And yet the Old Testament reveals all of these problems with Israel. For one thing, Israel has been split into 2 nations. You have the northern kingdom, and they were taken into exile and pretty much lost. And then you have the southern kingdom, which was made up mostly of Judah, who were taken into exile into Babylon around the 600s to 580s. When Judah was taken to Babylon originally, Nebuchadnezzar was in charge, and Babylon was ruling. But not long after that, the Persians took over. And the Persians had earned a reputation as good rulers. They were more lenient than Babylon. And they allowed the Israelites to go back. The Babylonian policy was expatriation, and yet the Persian policy was a little different. It was repatriation. And so almost right away, after the Persians took over, some Jews began going back to Jerusalem. Of course, we know this was in fulfillment of God's prophecy. This was part of God's plan. Now, not all of the Jews wanted to go back to Jerusalem because they were doing well in Babylon, but some went back, maybe because of the ministry of someone like Ezekiel. And it wasn't long afterwards that they began rebuilding the temple, which of course is why one of the names of this period is Second Temple Judaism. They finished rebuilding the temple around 520 to 515 BC, and around 445 BC, they finished the walls around Jerusalem, and that remained that way all the way to 70 AD when Rome destroyed the temple, which is a huge deal as well in the New Testament. But Persia ruled from 538 BC to 332 BC or so. And as we mentioned, the way they ruled was pretty laid back for a major empire, at least. Probably not pretty laid back to us, but for a major empire at that time. Pretty much they just wanted their taxes. But they didn't rule directly as much as they ruled through the Jewish high priests. So there were these Jewish high priests, and they were given increasing civil power, and they reported back to the Persians. That was how it was most of the time during these 400 years before Jesus. The Jews were a small, semi-independent state controlled by foreign groups through these high priests. And really, not only were there these 5 major groups ruling throughout these years, like Persia and Babylon and the Greeks and the Jews and Rome, there were also 5 major crises. And the first crises had taken place during the Babylonian period already. It began with Nebuchadnezzar destroying the temple. And that part's in the Old Testament. At first, Nebuchadnezzar had just taken the ruling class from Jerusalem and left everyone else there with someone named Zedekiah in charge. But Zedekiah flirted with Egypt, and so Nebuchadnezzar came again, executed his sons, blinded him, which really makes everything look terrible because of the Davidic covenant. Any attack on the Davidic king is an attack on the Messianic plan ultimately. And besides that, Nebuchadnezzar ended up deporting more people and destroying the temple, which they thought would never happen. And we've seen, as we study the Old Testament, they had all kinds of questions at this point. They were living outside of the land with no king, no temple. They were being severely disciplined by God. And during that discipline, that time of discipline, they really did learn some things. This crisis was used by God to instruct his people in some pretty significant ways. And one change that took place was that they became much more focused on studying the law. The prophets had been denouncing Israel for their disobedience to God's covenant. And finally, during this crisis, people began paying attention. Because they were living in a foreign land, though, they didn't have a temple to go to. The temple had been destroyed. And so they started just focusing on getting together and studying the law instead. And that's where synagogues developed. They started meeting in smaller groups to study God's word. And the second big change that took place was that the people renounced idolatry. So during this first crisis, the Babylonian exile, they slowly but surely began becoming more focused on the law of God. And second, they definitely, as a result, renounced idolatry, or at least pagan idolatry. It's evident coming back to the land that they didn't see idols the way they had before. And then the third big thing that happened was that their language changed. Babylon used a language that was related to Hebrew for commerce. It was called Aramaic, and this became the language that they spoke. And this language took over so completely that by the time Jesus came into this world, not many people knew Hebrew anymore. It was mostly just the scribes who spoke Hebrew. Everybody else pretty much spoke Aramaic. Of course, Babylon was defeated by the Persians around 539 BC, and several Old Testament books talk about this time as well. 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, some Psalms, Daniel, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And as I said, Cyrus had a different foreign policy than Nebuchadnezzar. It was more relaxed, and so he let conquered people keep their customs and religions in their home countries. So when Ezra asked Cyrus to let them go back, he agreed. Besides allowing Israel to go back to their own land, one of the other most important things that happened during this period is that the Old Testament was completed. Malachi was written sometime in the 400s, plus the temple was rebuilt. Persia ruled over Palestine for about 200 years until they were defeated by the Greeks. Apparently the Greeks and the Persians had been battling since the 500s, but it wasn't until 331 that Greece came under the rule of one of the greatest leaders the world has ever known, and as a result was able to completely, pretty much, destroy the Persian Empire as an empire. The leader's name was Alexander the Great, and around the age of 20, he began conquering the world, including Persia, and this began the second great crisis for Israel. Persia had let the Jews be Jews, but that wasn't Alexander's way. One of Alexander's goals was not only to conquer the world, but also to spread Greek culture and the Greek way of life. Alexander was a soldier, but he also was a student of someone named Aristotle. And he had this idea of wholeness. He wanted the entire world to think the same way. And this became a tremendous, tremendous crisis for the Jews that we'll talk about more in our next video.